It's now official. US GDP growth in the first quarter of 2025 was negative. The data leave no room for doubt. The slowdown is real and affects all sectors of the economy, from consumption to investment. Take note, because if this is repeated for another quarter, then the country will enter a technical recession. The reason has a name: Donald Trump. His return to the White House has brought with it a wave of uncertainty, taxes, and institutional disrepute that is sowing unease in both financial markets and amongst the country's trading partners. But we're not here to talk about this country today. When the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. The influence of the US economy is such that even a slight contraction can have devastating consequences for more fragile economies. The economy of many countries, especially developing ones, depends on the American empire. Exports, remittances, foreign direct investment, and even the decisions of local central banks are tied, to a greater or lesser extent, to what happens in Washington and on Wall Street. For example, in a recent video, we already told you about the impact Trump is having on the Venezuelan economy. But Venezuela is not the only Latin American country that could be mortally wounded by the tariff war.
Mexico slides towards recession amid Trump turmoil.
Just as you heard, Mexico declined by 0.6% in the last quarter of 2024, just before Donald Trump came to the White House. The economy was so weak that the Mexican central bank decided to cut interest rates by 50 basis points to give it a shot of adrenaline. But to give you a more tangible example, the telecommunications company owned by Carlos Slim, who you may know as one of the richest men in the world, has said that almost 820,000 Mexicans have cancelled their prepaid card service, and those who haven't are making shorter calls to save money. And just when everything seemed to be going wrong, then it started to go much, much worse. The new occupant of the White House has it in for Mexico. For Trump, his neighbors to the north and south are the main source of all his country's ills. But I'm sure he doesn't need to tell you that. As soon as he came to power, Trump used his extraordinary presidential powers to impose a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada. He then froze this tariff for a month and a bit, and then put it back in place, but with some nuances. If Mexico has already ended 2024 badly, the beginning of 2025 has been a nightmare. And pay attention, because as well as the tariffs, Pemex, Mexico's oil company, has been making losses for 4 months in a row. The goose that lays the golden eggs closed 2024 with 30 billion Mexican pesos in losses, and in the first 3 months of 2025, it lost another 43 billion pesos, roughly $2 billion. For all these reasons, there was no doubt that Mexico was going into a recession. Then, it surprised the world with this piece of news.
Mexico avoids technical recession with 0.2% GDP growth in Q1.
Under normal circumstances, 0.2% growth would be a resounding failure, but given the context facing Mexicans, we're talking about a very, very hopeful figure. What's more, some analysts are already saying that far from being a burden, Trump's tariff war could be a boon for Mexico. So where does that leave us? Is Donald Trump the savior of the Mexican economy? Will Mexico be able to avoid recession in the coming months? What has happened to reverse the negative trend? Today on Visualeconomik, we will be answering all these questions. To understand whether or not Trump's tariff war against the rest of the world could benefit Mexico, you first need to understand the trade relationship between these two countries. The Mexican economy is fully integrated with the US economy. To give just one example, 35% of its GDP comes from exports. And guess what percentage of all those exports go to the US? 30%? Half? No. We're talking about 80%. In other words, 28% of Mexico's entire GDP depends directly on trade with the United States. This relationship has been of great benefit to the US, especially in the aftermath of COVID. The pandemic made clear the critical importance of supply networks. American companies began to move their factories from Asia to other countries that were geographically and politically closer, the well-known friendshoring. And of course, Mexico was one of the big winners in this transformation. However, the US had already been transforming the Mexican economy for a few decades. In 1985, Mexico unilaterally eliminated many of the tariffs and regulations that hindered trade with its northern neighbor. A few years later, NAFTA, a free trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico was signed. This caused the weight of international trade in Mexico's GDP to triple in just 20 years, from 10% in 1980 to 30% in the 2000s, and the results were very positive. For example, the areas of the country most exposed to international trade experienced a much stronger wage boom than the rest of the country. Although, while everyone benefited, in particular, the most educated workers benefited the most. This is a sign that US companies were not only looking for cheap labor in their poor neighbor, but also demanded highly skilled personnel such as industrial engineers. Well, curiously, let me tell you that there was another group that came out exceptionally well off. Guess who? Women. Not only did their wages grow much faster than men's, household consumption also became much more balanced between typically male and typically female expenditure. In summary, trade with the US is not only a fundamental part of the Mexican economy, but also a socio-economic driver that would be very difficult to replace. And now, Trump's tariffs may strike at the very heart of Mexico's economy. For example, its manufacturing sector has contracted by more than 2% since Trump came to the White House. What's more, according to the Peterson Institute, the 25% tariffs could reduce Mexico's GDP by 2% by 2029. That's basically a whole year of lost economic growth. And the worst doesn't end here. In 2024, the Mexican peso depreciated 23% against the US dollar. Normally, this would be a very negative thing. It means that Mexicans can buy fewer things abroad. But in this context, it may be the least bad option. The reason, we've told you many times on this channel, currency revaluation tends to offset the effect of tariffs. Normally, when the US puts a tariff on the rest of the world, the dollar appreciates. This makes Americans able to buy more things from beyond their borders, which compensates for the fact that those things are now more expensive. Well, this 23% devaluation would serve to offset the 25% tariffs that Trump imposed as soon as he arrived in the Oval Office. And this is good news, but there is one problem. After Liberation Day, the Mexican peso did not depreciate, quite the contrary. As we've also told you on this channel, Donald Trump has cast doubt on the dollar. Investors are no longer so confident that it's the safe haven asset everyone thought it was, so its value is plummeting. What's more, following Liberation Day, the Mexican peso experienced one of its largest single-day increases in recent years. It's worth noting that part of this appreciation is, in truth, the effect of the dollar's plummeting value. If we compare the Mexican peso with other currencies, such as the euro, the appreciation is much smaller. But this is not what is important. The crucial factor here is that this time, the exchange rate will not come to the rescue of the Mexican economy. The upside is that, for now, it doesn't need to. Mexico has managed to evade a good part of the tariffs. In the end, Donald Trump has had to respect trade treaties, if only a little. The 25% tariff remains in place, but did not suffer the additional tariffs on Liberation Day. Not even the 10% the US maintained a few days later for all countries, except China. But take note that there's fine print. We're not talking about 25% for all products. 55% of Mexican goods exports are covered by the TMEC USMCA, which is the evolution of NAFTA. And Visualeconomik community, tariffs do not apply to these goods, at least today. However, there is one good that is particularly sensitive: automobiles. 15% of Mexican exports corresponds to vehicles that comply with TMEC USMCA clauses to be tariff-free, which basically applies to products 75% made in Mexico. However, all those cars, trucks, and components that fall outside the TMEC or other very specific regulatory umbrellas do have to pay a 25% tariff. What does all this mean? Well, the tariffs that Mexico actually pays on its total exports would be between 4 and 8%. What's more, the Trump administration has put lower tariffs on the table as long as Mexico commits to stopping fentanyl and immigrant smuggling at the border. Although, at the end of the day, there are no objective criteria on the table, so ultimately it will be whatever Trump thinks is best. At the moment, all indications are that Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, is doing everything she can to appease Trump in this regard. And she also seems to have been clear with the White House. Mexico is doing everything it can to reduce drug and human trafficking to the United States. But if the US kills their economy, what incentive do they have to continue to do so? It certainly seems like a very powerful card for Sheinbaum to play, considering that, as of today, the only area where the Trump administration seems to be getting public support is in managing the southern border. If that goes wrong, they will be in serious trouble. The fact is that most analysts thought that Sheinbaum was going to be something of a political puppet of López Obrador, but the truth is that the new president has done a 180-degree turn from the hugs, not bullets policy of her predecessor.
In her first 100 days, Sheinbaum seized over 100 times more arms than Lopez Obrador did in the same period, and 2,000 times more drugs.
Be that as it may, what is important, what is really important, is that the rest of the countries have a general tariff of 10%, to which other specific tariffs such as 25% for vehicles, steel, or aluminium must also be added. At least right now. We'll see what happens when the 90-day grace period expires. So even if the tariffs hurt the Mexican economy, if Trump puts a lot more tariffs on the rest of the world, then comparatively speaking, it could come out ahead. I'm sure you're not surprised that the Mexican stock market was one of the few that remained healthy on the famous Liberation Day. We've told you before, following the pandemic, many companies moved their factories from Asia to Mexico, but many others moved from China to more friendly countries like Indonesia or Vietnam. However, these countries were singled out in the famous table of liberalizing tariffs with rates of 40%, which makes Mexican assembly plants a much more attractive place to invest, even if only comparatively. But hold on a minute. Many companies will bring their production to Mexico, but others will try to use Mexico as a front company to sell their products in the US. Surely you've heard news about how the purchase of oil from countries such as India or Azerbaijan skyrocketed after the sanctions against Russia. And let's see, obviously Azerbaijan did not multiply its production by 10 times, it simply resold Russian crude oil to get around the sanctions. Well, many in Washington fear that Mexico may be doing exactly the same thing, and this could raise new barriers to trade. And let's see, reasons for that suspicion. Well, what can I say? There's no shortage of them. You're looking at China's exports to Mexico on the screen, and one thing jumps out. When Trump first came to the White House, China started selling its products to Mexico like there was no tomorrow. But it doesn't end there. On paper, foreign direct investment from the Asian giant in Mexico has been practically stagnant for a decade. But there are analyses made by teams of independent economists who calculate that the real figure is 6 times higher than the official one. Obviously, there's no need for me to explain what was going on. The Made in Mexico was really a Made in China, although this has also been exaggerated. This is not to say that all exports from China to Mexico are fraudulent. In many cases, we're talking about Chinese companies that assemble components in Mexico, a trend that is on the rise. One fact. In 2000, only 5% of Mexico's exports to the US contained Chinese components, but today, that figure is 21%. The question is, will Washington tolerate China's continued use of Mexico as a Trojan horse, even if only for a small percentage of its exports? We don't know, but if the Trump administration hasn't taken much concrete action against this, chances are that things will continue as they are now. Nevertheless, even if the Republican administration does not change the rules at this stage of the game, it's not clear that Mexico's situation is sustainable. Yes, I know, we just said that Mexico has a very big comparative advantage over other countries now that Trump has declared his trade war, and this explains why it has managed to avoid going into recession so far. But unfortunately, things are never that simple. Some analysts point to another explanation, that the Mexicans have taken advantage of the first quarter of the year to export as much as they can before tariffs are triggered. If this were true, then it makes sense that the economic activity has been positive, but in return, performance in the following months will be even worse than normal. After all, tariffs don't just move economic activity around. If this were the case, then Mexico would be a clear winner. But these taxes also destroy wealth, so no matter how many factories the Vietnamese decide to move to Mexico, there's always the possibility that the devastation to the local economy will be greater. At the moment, Claudia Sheinbaum's popularity is sky high at around 80%, and Mexicans seem quite optimistic about the direction their economy is taking. Although being so dependent on Donald Trump's regime, well, what can I say? Nothing is guaranteed. And having come this far, it's now your turn. What is the main reason why Mexico has avoided recession against all odds? Does it really benefit from Trump declaring a trade war on the rest of the world? Will we see more investment in Mexico, or will other countries just use it as a cover? You can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so don't hesitate to subscribe to follow everything that's coming up. If you like this video, let us know by hitting the like button. All the best. I'll see you next time.